On a dark, moonless night in the year of our Lord, 1314, Thomas Randolph, the young Earl of Moray, gathered a small band of warriors round him. They were about to embark on a daring attempt to scale the sheer rock face of Edinburgh Castle and take the garrison by surprise. The second last castle, still in English hands in the whole of Scotland, was about to fall into the hands of the Scots. The long war of Scottish independence was approaching its immortal climax. It was a bleak and stormy day in March 1286, when Alexander III, King of Scots, presided over what was to be the last meeting of his council. They met high above Edinburgh, in the Castle of the Maidens. Little of importance was discussed, and afterwards, ignoring the foul weather and the advice of his companions, he insisted on rejoining his queen at Kingaun, on the other side of the Forth. Alexander crossed the river safely by the Queen's Ferry. But in the rain and in the darkness, he somehow became separated from his guides. Next morning, he was found on the beach with his neck broken. The stage was now set for a bitter struggle.
Daunt his weapons upon armour stent, and so spears sae great bristling with sic thran and sic thrusting, sic gun and groaning, sic great a noise as assailed in another, and cry its slogans on every side. Ah, it was hideous for to hear them.
Behind the desperately embattled knights, the English infantry at first stood idly by, unable to intervene in the struggle. From time to time, the archers amongst them tried to provide at least some assistance by shooting over the knights' heads in the hope of dropping their shafts in among the closely packed ranks of Scots pikemen on the other side of the melee. Unfortunately, they also succeeded in shooting many of their own men in the back and were soon ordered to stop. Then some other archers, led by professional soldiers, ran out onto the right of the English line, well clear of the fighting, playing about hitting their own men. As the casualties amongst the pikemen mounted, Bruce called upon his own cavalry. There were 500 of them, not heavily armoured knights, but light horsemen, capable of moving very swiftly. The English archers had no defensive stakes to protect them, or heavy spearmen to back them up, and Sir Robert Keith's charge was completely successful. The archers were quickly scattered and cut down. The threat to the Scots flank had been averted. In the centre, the battle was going equally badly for the English. Even King Edward had to defend himself with his mace, his hands pulled and tugged at his harness. The battle had been raging for an hour now, and at this point there was an unexpected development. Bruce knew that his men would soon be tiring, but being a good general, he had kept his very last reserve for just this moment. Legend has it that the men who now suddenly appeared on the top of Coxet Hill in the New Park were camp followers. A motley and quite harmless collection of grooms, peasants, cooks and sutlers with makeshift banners. In reality, they were actually Highland clansmen or gillies. They lacked the training and discipline necessary to make good pikemen, and because they could not stand up to the English cavalry in the open, Bruce had left them hidden amongst the trees of the New Park. However, now that the knights were fully occupied in fighting the Scots pikemen, the king called the Highlanders forward. Their intervention was decisive. As the clansmen appeared on the hill above the battlefield, Bruce called out to his men, "Upon them! On them recht hardily!" And the final push began. To their dismay, the English knights saw the Scots reinforcements come flooding forward. And then the dismay turned to horror as they realized that the despised foot soldiers were actually driving them backwards, deeper into the bog.
In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cummings, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers, who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas earlier they had crossed a great ditch called Bannockburn into which the tide flows, when they tried to recross it in confusion, many of the nobles fell back with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many could not extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus was Bannockburn spoken about for many years in English throats.
Not all of the English knights ran away, or even tried to. Sir Giles d'Argentine, an old crusader, fought his way through to King Edward's side, led him safely from the battlefield, and then, declaring, "I have never been accustomed to run," he returned to the fight and certain death. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had won his battle, but the killing was far from over. It is generally true to say that before the invention of gunpowder, few men were actually killed in battle. The vast majority of those who died were cut down while fleeing after the fighting had ended. This was certainly true at Bannockburn. Although many Scots pikemen were killed, mainly by English arrows, only 2 Scottish knights, Sir William de Vipon and Sir Walter Ross, were slain. As for the defeated English, so many of them were killed in trying to flee back across the Bannockburn that it was said to be possible afterwards to walk dry-shod over the corpses. The relentless pursuit went on till nightfall, which at midsummer came very late in the day. King Edward himself made first for Stirling Castle, the nearest and perhaps most obvious refuge. But the governor was already short of provisions, and pointed out to the king that he would soon be forced to surrender. Eventually, a knight was found who was able to guide King Edward round the back of the victorious Scottish army and then eastwards to Dunbar, where he found a ship to carry him back to England. Others were rather less fortunate, as the Lanercost chronicler relates.
As the king and his following fled in one direction, so the Earl of Hereford, the Earl of Angus, Sir John de Seagrave, Sir Anthony de Lucy, and Sir Ingram de Umfreville, with a great crowd of knights, 600 other mounted men, and 1,000 foot, fled in another direction towards Carlisle. The Earl of Pembroke left the army on foot and saved himself with the fugitive Welsh. But the aforesaid earls and others, who had fled towards Carlisle, were captured on the way at Bothwell Castle, for the warden, Sir Walter Gilbertson, a Scot who had held the castle down to that time for the King of England, perceiving that his countrymen had won the battle, allowed the chief men who came thither to enter the castle in the belief that they would find a safe refuge, and when they had entered, he took them prisoners. Many also were taken, wandering around the castle and hither and thither in the country, and many were killed. It was said also that certain knights were captured by women, nor did any of them get back to England save in abject confusion. After this victory, Robert the Bruce was commonly called King of Scotland by all men, because he had acquired Scotland by force of arms.
Chroniclers were inclined to look for the hand of God in such a decisive victory, won against such heavy odds. It was even claimed that the English defeat was by way of divine retribution for the plundering of a monastery on the way north, but the real reasons were purely military ones. In the first place, Bruce chose his ground wisely. While his pikemen were able to operate effectively on the muddy Carsland, it was totally unsuitable for the heavy English cavalry. Although he made preparations to fight a defensive battle in the New Park if he had to, he probably intended right from the very beginning to fight the battle in the Carse if he could. Secondly, although his army was greatly outnumbered by the English one, it was much better trained. King Edward's knights were extremely brave, but undisciplined. As a result, their superior numbers were more of a handicap than an advantage. In simple terms, they all got in each other's way. Worse still, there was no effective chain of command on the English side. Not only was Bruce able to control his army, he was also able to judge when best to commit his reserves to the fighting. His own Skiltron had rescued an outflanked left wing. The dangerous threat posed by the English archers was promptly dealt with by a well-timed cavalry charge, and his final reserve, the Highland Gillies, was called forward at precisely the right psychological moment. King Robert and his army won the Battle of Bannockburn because they deserved to.
Well, there's no gainsaying the overall significance of the Battle of Bannockburn. It earned Scotland 3 centuries of freedom from English rule. Independence, in other words. But militarily speaking, we also learned some very important lessons from this engagement. First of all, there was a danger of overconfidence. English armies had often defeated Scots armies in previous occasions, particularly the Battle of the Standard is a very good example of that, and they were therefore somewhat over-assured of success, and that is always a dangerous thing. Furthermore, many of the young knights who were now in the army for probably the first time in 1314 were inexperienced and certainly indisciplined in the way they conducted their duties, and that was linked to this matter of being overconfident. The English also learnt the vital importance of a good leader. Now, no one can impugn Edward II's bravery. He fought extremely bravely on this particular day. But that was not his role. He was meant to be in control, and that he was not. Nor had he deputed control to another big magnate in his behalf. So there are arguments amongst the next commanders about what they were supposed to be doing. So it all broke down on this matter of having a real leader in charge. English losses were pretty horrendous. 22 earls, 68 barons, 1,000 spearmen and archers. And as we know, a further 1,500 became prisoners later, having been tricked into entering a castle. So this was a very severe defeat for the English feudal army. And it was going to be some years before it could pick up its act again and make the whole thing highly effective. But of course, in Edward III, the next king, we were to bring one of our foremost kings of all periods as a soldier, fighter, into the scene, and the days of Edward II would soon be forgotten.
Nevertheless, as the Lanercost chronicler sadly admitted, Bruce had decisively proved his right to the throne of Scotland at Bannockburn. Arguably, King Edward I had in fact been justified in considering the King of Scots to be his feudal vassal, but the long wars of independence established that the ordinary people of Scotland owed no fealty to England's king. This determination was made explicit in the Declaration of Arbroath, drawn up 6 years later in 1320. In it, Bruce's part in the struggle is fulsomely acknowledged. But it goes on to state that should he fail his people, we would instantly strive to expel him as our enemy and the betrayer of his own rights and ours, and we would choose another king to rule over us, who would be equal to the task of defence. It is the shortest paragraph in the Declaration, however, which is the most significant, and which still thunders down the centuries. For so long as 100 men remain alive, we shall never, under any condition, submit to the domination of the English. It is not for glory, or riches, or honours that we fight, but only for liberty, which no good man will consent to lose but with his life.